agenda for today and also some housekeeping. Before I do, I just wanted to share a short story on this subject, and it dates back to about 10 years ago when I heard one of our team members here at Amoria Bond consulting with a customer about the need to thoroughly prepare for a job interview. And essentially, he was explaining to the customer that an interview is a false environment, and therefore, in order for both the customer to see the true potential of the candidate and vice versa, and for them ultimately to come to the right decision, he needed to go through what was a thorough interview preparation exercise. And I think that's the essence of really what we're here to discuss today. And joining me to discuss that and to talk about that topic are two experts, one of our own, Marc Danielski, and one of our known, Marc Stuut. Now, clearly they're both called Marc, so I'm going to have to use their full names as we go through. So firstly, Marc Stuut, great to have you here. Could you share your bio with us, please?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Andrew, for the introductions, and welcome everyone to this session today. My name is Marc Stuut, and I'm based out of the Netherlands, and I'm working for a company named Ingram, where I'm responsible for leading our talent acquisition organization across EMEA. And from a global point of view, that's our talent, branding, and marketing organization.
Thanks, Marc. Great to have you here. And Marc Danielski?
Yes, thanks, Andrew, and welcome everybody from my side. My name is Marc Danielski. I'm head of the talent attraction division for Amoria Bond in Amsterdam and Germany as well. I am German myself, but I've been living in the Netherlands for the better part of 12 years, and I've been in recruitment for about 9 of them.
Thanks, Marc. Before we start, I know you've been doing some research in particular surrounding this subject, in particular the impact of mishires. So actually the opposite of doing excellent job interviews. What have you found out?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of research on the topic and especially why it is so important to conduct excellent interviews in the first place. And there's the obvious part. You want to attract the best possible talent to your organization, and you obviously want to present yourself in the best possible way to make yourself as a company attractive. But to provide a little bit of more meat on the bone on the topic, as you said, one of the biggest issues that companies are having nowadays is obviously the danger of mishiring, meaning hiring talent into the organization that in the end doesn't perform or leaves the company in a short time frame, or maybe not being a cultural fit at all. And what most people don't realize, actually the cost of mishire, which is about 3 times the salary, the monthly salary that a candidate would receive. So obviously that already goes to show that there's a big financial impact in, conducting good interviews and hiring the right talent into the business. On top of that, what is also quite important to note is nowadays a lot of interviews are obviously happening online, and the opportunities for people to get reviews of companies that they're interviewing with is, well, quite easy. You have websites like Glassdoor, Kununu, Google reviews, even LinkedIn, where people can share their experiences. So it is obviously about social branding and positioning yourself and your company in a good light in the market. So conducting an excellent interview is the best way to represent yourself and build a good image as well.
Thanks, Marc. So let's move to our agenda. So on that subject today, we're going to look at some of the do's and don'ts when interviewing. We're going to look at what the STARR method is and how we can use that, how you can sell your business and yourself, and finally, some preparation tips. Just before we start, let's cover some housekeeping, and I'm going to check my list because I need to make sure I get this right. We'll be here for about 45 minutes, so we greatly appreciate all of your time today, and we will try and have you away within a 45-minute window. We would welcome collaboration and interaction. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, any comments, any anecdotes. Anything in that vein, we would greatly appreciate it, and we will share them towards the end. And effectively, that's it. So let's get started. As mentioned, our first question, which I'll put to Marc Stuut first of all, is what would you say are some of the main do's and don'ts when interviewing?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that we can start with setting 3 main categories if it's related to the do's. So I would suggest to always start by setting the stage, right? So it's very much about giving a good introduction about who you are as a person, together with who you are as a professional, but also to position the organization in a concise way so that the individual that you're interviewing knows exactly who you are and what the organization is about. But also, I would suggest before digging into all the questions and the answers that will be provided, to ask the candidate if any accommodations are required for the interview. There could be some situations going on specifically when we interview candidates virtually that we need to be mindful of. So always ask that question. But also what I think is extremely important, because you need to work hard when doing specifically virtual interviews, is to establish rapport, right? It's good to start with that, to build up a relationship in a very short period of time so that the candidate feels at ease. I would say that the second main category is to gain behavioral examples, right? To start with that, it's about describing the interview process. They might have read something online at your website, though you have been providing some information prior to the interview, but it's good to walk through the interview process so that they know what to expect throughout the process. But I think it's also very good to start with is that you ask the candidate to provide a concise summary about their professional experience, but also who they are as a person. I think that even the latter is most important, right, to start off with that. But providing that concise summary also allows you to evaluate whether the candidate is able to provide you with such a summary in a limited manner, providing you with the most important information. And then if it's related to the interview questions that will follow, I always recommend to use behavioral-based questions. So there are many competencies that are relevant for a position, but please pick out the ones 3 to 5 that are most important. And I will come back to a little bit later on about how to select those 3 to 5 competencies. But ask those behavioral questions. We're also going to speak about the STARR method, which is definitely going to support you in asking these type of questions. What I also think is extremely important with this main category is to monitor non-verbal communication and overall interaction. Extremely important. You need to be able to pick that up throughout the conversation, to be mindful of that. Don't ignore non-verbal communication. Well, if it's about the third main category, it's about closing the interview, right? It's also about providing the candidate with the opportunity to be asking questions. It's not only a Q&A from the interview to the interviewer to the interviewee. It's also about that the candidate should be able to answer questions that are relevant to the individual at this moment in time. And then also, I would say what is extremely important, review the timeline for the selection process. Specifically, if you're very keen on a position where you would like to know what's next, when do I hear back from you? And then finally, what is also extremely important, that's not so much related to the interview itself, but the interview process, is have an interview panel discussion on the final candidate selection and feedback. That is extremely important. I will speak a little bit later on about how such an interview panel will work. So definitely do's in that context. The don'ts is what I would highly recommend is don't assume a candidate's past experience indicate their future success or competency. Don't do that. You don't use extrovert, introvert, or ambivert bias to qualify or disqualify a candidate. You might be very extrovert, and when you're speaking to a candidate that might be a little bit more introvert, don't qualify the candidate based on that, as an example. Also, do not use microaggressions or micro invalidations to validate or confirm the quality of a candidate response. Examples could be, I didn't expect that response, or you are so well spoken and articulate. Finally, what I also do not recommend is to use too much jargon or acronyms. We can see this a lot within organizations. A lot of acronyms are being used, a lot of jargon, too many details, numbers. They will not remember that. So stick to what's most important. Provide information in a concise manner so that they will remember. So that will be my take on this.
Thanks, Marc. I think the one that stood out, there was a lot of really useful information there. What I like with this introduction of them, I like the fact you didn't discount the personal experience. I've seen that go 2 ways, actually. I saw in one interview, this was for a C-level position, I think, where the candidate was asked to describe their their experience personally and professionally, and basically spent 3 minutes describing how they like their hobby around gardening, and didn't get to the point around any of the actual keys around being a COO. But nevertheless, it seems like you're using that almost as one of the first assessment criteria. Can they stick to the kind of 3-minute parameter, and actually, so can they deliver on point, and can they meet the brief that you've given them?
Yeah, definitely. And this is also where you don't need to be shy about interrupting people, right? Because typically you schedule like an interview for 45 minutes, an hour, and you need to take most out of the time, right? So if you don't get the relevant information, just mention it. Of course, let them finish their sentence and then interrupt by saying, hey, that's all good information, but I have some additional information that I would like to get from you. Please also allow yourself to interrupt. One thing that I'm thinking about, what is also extremely important with regards to all of this, is also make sure that you don't have any prior meetings that is ending on the minute that you start with the interview, or have a meeting at the minute just after the interview. Because then you feel rushed, then you need to say, well, sorry, but I do have other priorities, you need to jump off. So please make sure that you have some additional time prior and after the interview.
That's a really good one, because we've all been there. I'm sure we've literally ran from one meeting, parachuted into an interview with the best of intentions. We're here to discuss conducting excellent job interviews. Well, one way to not conduct an excellent job interview is to zoom in and zoom out of one. You almost need to be clear of what you've done previously, and be present in that meeting, and then like you said, not be having to rush off again. That will clearly impact the success of the interview itself. Thanks very much. Marc, Danielski?
Yes,
your
of course.
do's and don'ts?
First of all, Marc, thank you very much. Quite an exhaustive list there. Took the wind out of my sails a little bit, but I really like the point there as well of putting enough time away to actually conduct the interview, because worst thing that can happen is a candidate actually having a lot of questions that could provide relevant insight into their profile, but also give them a good insight into the company and the role, and there not being enough time. That either means that question will be left unanswered, or that a follow-up conversation needs to be booked, which, knowing there are always busy agendas involved, means it might take a lot of time, which obviously provides the candidate with poor experience, and us running risk of obviously losing the candidate to one of our competitors. So very, very good point, really like it. And also like the split into basically 3 different parts. And I want to elaborate maybe a little bit further on them from my side, because the first part, as you said, is very much about expectation management, relationship building, and also scene setting. And something that we are very familiar with is obviously conducting interviews via Microsoft Teams or via Zoom online, or even in person, right? But depending on which industry you work in, operating online is not necessarily something that a lot of people are that familiar with. So that obviously, creates a little bit of a nervous scenario. People enter the room, microphone's not working, the camera doesn't switch on, and they're already starting into an interview, basically being, one step behind. So for conducting a proper interview, I think it's very, very important to put their mind at ease, obviously do a little bit of scene setting, easing them into the interview and into the conversation, not starting right away of, I have no time, introduce yourself, share everything you have to share around your CV, right? But doing a proper introduction, letting the candidate introduce them on a personal level as well, walking through the structure of the interview. And what I always like to mention in the beginning as well, that I find it very, very important for candidates to ask questions throughout the conversation and not just wait until the end, because that creates more of a dialogue between the interviewer and the interviewee, which is usually much more pleasurable experience for everybody involved, rather than just firing question after question after question, and then the candidates saving all of their questions for the end, when both parties might not have the time to answer them all. So that's something I always like to do as well. Something that is maybe a do and a don't at the same token. You always say there's no second chance for a first impression, right? But we just covered that not everybody is familiar with the concept of doing interviews online. So maybe try to not let biases interfere with the flow of an interview, especially when conducted online, and give people the time to ease into the conversation before you make any snap judgments. It's 100% something I find very, very important, and where I have had my struggles with myself, not going to lie. I would also say throughout the conversation, you made a very, very good point. Competency-based questions. It's not what's on the CV, because the candidate knows this and we know this as well, but we need to go a step further. Yeah, guide them through their CV, ask follow-up question, go a little bit more in depth and gain insight into the skills and experience they've gained throughout their career, rather than just the hard skills that I mentioned on this CV already. And I know we're going to touch on this a little bit in depth on the STAR method, but I think it's just worth mentioning again, because very, very important. And then, well, you already covered a lot of points, but what I want to elaborate on as well is after the interview. So the interview doesn't happen at the moment that I go out of the meeting, but the interview is going on. And the worst thing that a recruiter can do, in my opinion, is after the decision was made not to proceed with the candidate, is just to send a follow-up email informing the candidate that they are not suitable and not hired for the role, because that will, well, annihilate the candidate from ever working with the company again, in my opinion. That could obviously be very relevant for a future opportunity, not this particular one, but a future opportunity. There could be a great source of information or referrals potentially as well. And once again, the point I made in the beginning is it's all about also positioning your company and social branding, and just the courtesy of following up with a quick phone call of 2 minutes explaining why we did not proceed with the candidate can actually go quite a long way with the experience that somebody has in the interview process.
Thanks, Marc. I think you touched on this earlier on. When I'm setting these interviews up, I'm always trying to create a relaxed environment, because again, ultimately, I'll link back to the point I made at the beginning. This is a false environment, and if we're actually going to see the true potential of who's sat across the table or on the screen with us, unless they're in a relaxed state, it's highly unlikely that we're going to do that. And I, therefore, as you already mentioned, I do say to them that this is a two-way conversation. Ultimately, we're as invested in this going well as you are. We should all, if you're feeling nervous, we should ultimately be as nervous as you, because we have big hiring needs, and great people are hard to come by. So actually, if the pressure's on anyone today, it should be on us. So as part of setting the scene, for me, those are some key do's. I'm just going to throw this question out there, then we'll move on. Why do you want to work for us? Do or don't?
I can start us off on that one. Depends very much on the situation. I usually don't like to ask it. I think it's a two-way street, and in today's environment, it's so easy to apply for roles that candidates should want to work for the company, but especially when it's a first conversation, the first interview, they will not have done a lot of in-depth research, and they will come to the conversation literally expecting me as the expert within the company to explain them why we are a good place to work. That's where the two-way street comes in. It's all about obviously the candidate convincing me that they're right fit for us, but it's even, well, same importance or even more important for me to explain to them why we are the right place for them. So I usually don't ask the question myself.
I'm fully with Marc on this, and I think that if you can't get this out of the interview by the enthusiasm of the individual, the answers provided, you don't need to ask that question to get the answer throughout the interview. So that would be a done for me as well. Great,
thanks. So looking at the STAR method, Marc Danielski, would you kindly go through what the actual that stands for, STAR, and then how we can actually use that then within the interview itself?
Yeah, so the STAR method is actually a method, or could be used by both candidates and the person interviewing candidates on competency-based questions. So questions that are not solely one-way answer, but that provide more evidence on experiences or skills gained over their career or within life situations. And what STAR stands for is situation, task, action, result, and the last R was added as reflection. So basically situation being, as the name already indicates, a situation that the candidate was in where they had to obviously act on a certain thing or a certain experience happening within the environment. The task, what was the particular task that the candidate was tasked with in that situation? So what were they in need to do? The action being, what did they actually do to fulfill these tasks? Then result, what was the outcome? And one of the more important parts, in my opinion, is also the reflection. So basically looking back, what have they learned from that experience? How have they developed, and how has their skill set changed since that situation as well?
Yeah, and to add to that, so the STARR method is very well known to many people, right? What we can also see and hear about often is the ETOLA method. It's pretty much the same, but then a different acronym. It's about actions, thinking, outcome, learnings, and application, but it's pretty much the same. What I think is also very much interesting about these methods, there also should be questions raised around it. So it's also about the role. So it's not only about the action and the responsibility, but what was the role in the specific scenario that the individual is describing. And it's extremely important to understand if it was an individual type of action, if it was or a situation, or did the individual work with a team, and then what it's good to know in the team, what was the role of the individual.
Now, I think on that point, it's very, very important to make sure that the person doesn't only talk about the team, though, because I have heard people literally drifting off and just telling how amazing that team was, not giving any insight into what their involvement actually was, but it should all be about the individual itself, while obviously covering their involvement in the team as well.
Yeah.
It seems to me, when I've heard this in action and used it myself, that human nature seems to be people are in general, unless they are a specific type characteristic, they're a little bit averse to actually really going into actions they took or achievements they made or experienced, when actually that's fundamentally during the interview process what most interviewers want to know about, right? They're buying into this individual potentially to see if their organization and role is right for them. How do you see that play out, Marc Stuut? Do you see something similar, that people tend to have an aversion to actually feel like they're showing off or showcasing their experiences?
So I think that's a very interesting question, Andrew. So it also depends on the individual, right? So we all have different types of personalities. I just alluded to people that are more extrovert, more introvert, more ambivert. So they're using both extrovert and introvert. So typically what you see, and this is common with what people are more extrovert, they are feeling much more comfortable speaking about successes than people who are introvert, more introvert by nature. But I think it's very much about asking the right questions once again here, right? It's to be very mindful of following a specific competency-based question, so that you really understand what you're saying is true or not, or just or not. I don't necessarily mind people who are exaggerating a bit or think that they actually have been doing a great job, but they need to be able to provide those tangible examples, right? If they're not able to provide tangible examples, that's an indicator to me that they might be exaggerating, or maybe someone else was predominantly responsible for the success that they are showcasing. So I think that being on top of that throughout the questions is extremely important. Feel free to also interrupt the individual to provide more concise, more tangible examples. I think that is extremely important. On the other hand side, if you talk to more introverted people, it's also to challenge them by providing those examples. They typically are not by nature willing to put themselves in the spotlight. And I think it's very much about setting a scene where they are comfortable. We already spoke about that, so they are able to speak freely. And I think that definitely helps for the more introverted people, so that they feel at ease to speak about their successes in the past. One pitfall that I see a lot with candidates is that they speak about past successes, and past successes not only predominantly referring to like 5 or 10 years ago. So I would be less interested to know what they've done 10 years ago, because that's too long ago, right? That might not be relevant anymore. So I would always suggest to guide it in a way to provide more recent type of experiences and results than going back like 10 years or 15 years. Some people, when they're providing their summary about their professional experience, they said, well, I started my career 30, 40 years ago in that specific industry, and this is what I did at that moment in time. That's not relevant. So you also feel free to interrupt once again to actually ask, hey, could you please provide me with a more recent example that is still connected to the competency?
Great, thanks. How would you set this up then, just to turn this into a practical sense? So we've got the STARR method. We're looking at this. It's very applicable to competencies and behaviours. Could you give us an example of how you might set this up with somebody then in that interview?
Yeah, definitely. So once again, if you have defined the competencies, an example could be about managing complexity, right? So if it's a position where you need to have a lot of focusing on details, you can ask a question about, hey, how have you been able to manage a project successfully where you have dealt with a lot of complexity? Just an open question to start with. And then it comes down to the example provided where you can ask follow-up questions. So that would be up to the interpretation of the candidate, right? So another example could be, could you please describe a situation where you needed to demonstrate the highest amount of flexibility in your position? So there could be anything, right? But then it's then matching the answers with what you're looking for, guiding that more into that direction. So if it's about, I would say sales, a sales position, and it would be for small, medium businesses, you can ask more questions around it. Like, could you please provide an example about the most challenging sales opportunity that you went through in the past 2 years, as an example? And then how you were able to influence the stakeholders that were part of the decision-making unit, and stop there. And then ask those follow-up questions based on the information provided. So start with the open questions, definitely maybe also don't close questions where there's a yes or a no answer. Don't do that at all. Just ask open questions and let the conversation organically flow.
Great, yeah, thanks. Go ahead.
Maybe I can elaborate on that. I definitely agree with those points. And I actually have quite an example I applied earlier today in an interview I conducted for our company, where, to give a little bit of backstory, something that we're always looking for in candidates is resilience. So basically the ability to deal with hardships, to deal with challenges, to deal with hearing no every day, which is something that's quite common in obviously a sales role and then a recruitment role as well. So there's something that I'm always quite keen to check with candidates. However, if you ask the question, in what situations did you have to show a lot of resilience, right? A lot of candidates are really struggling with that one because, some people might not be that familiar with the concept. It's very hard to remember a situation where you really had to show a lot of strength to overcome a challenge. And then the STAR method actually comes in quite handy because you can use it to literally tick off the different aspects with the candidate. And you can lead into that as well. It's like, okay, let's start with the situation. What situation were you in when you had to show a lot of resilience? And then let them describe the situation. Move on to the task, right? What did you need to do in that situation? What did you actually do? How has that affected the outcome of the challenge that you were facing, right? If you now look back, would you do something again? And you can literally walk them through the 5 steps of the STAR method to gain more evidence, but also help them express their experience in a much better way. Yeah, so that's what you mentioned with introvert people have that by nature, but a lot of people that struggle with some interview question could apply this themselves if they aren't able to do it because they might not be familiar with the concept. It's our job as the interviewer in that sense to walk them through the different steps to help them express their experience while also keeping the structure of the interview and not letting them drift off into, only the situation and then you just somewhere completely different in the interview while not getting the evidence that you were looking for.
Yeah, it's a great point because I was actually going to get to that question about how would you go about if someone is struggling to give you the evidence or provide the evidence, and or there might be an example where they're simply not getting to the point. And I've been in situations where I've actually explained to them, almost broken down the STAR method with them and said, this is actually the structure I want you to follow. It's also a good opportunity to see how they take feedback or how they can improve, because again, clearly that's something as an employer we're going to want to see. And there have been scenarios and interviews where in that situation where people have got quite defensive or have really struggled to, even with the coaching and the guidance, have really struggled to actually then articulate what they need to do. So that's answered that question. So thanks for that. Any other closing thoughts on STAR method before we move into, in a very competitive business environment, how we're going to sell ourselves and our businesses?
And one final point that I would like to add to Marc's story, with whom I very much agree with what he just mentioned, is also the reflection piece, right? What I like the most is people not only saying, well, this is what I've done successfully, but also this is where I was not so successful. This is what I learned, and this is how I am applying this today. That tell something about the candidate and the way to take feedback, potentially also from people that provided that, not only a self-assessment, and to strive for being better and to develop. And I think that is always something that I appreciate the most. So not only about talking about the things that have gone well, but also things that have not gone well, and what they have learned from that.
Yeah, absolutely. That level of self-awareness. So in
Yeah.
summary, we've got get at the beginning or previously, prior to the interview, establish the behaviors and competencies, use the STARR method for gathering evidence around them. When you're asking questions around this, make sure that they're nice and open at the beginning, and really don't overlook or forget that R of reflection to go into that level of emotional competence, emotional intelligence that might be there. Very interesting, thank you. Who wants to sell themselves and their business first?
I will start, if that's okay, Marc.
Of course, go for it.
So I think it's not so much about, let's say, to start with the industry or the type of company that you are, because most likely there will be other companies that are doing similar things as your organization does, right? What is unique to your organization is your culture, right? There might be similar types of cultures across organizations, but your organizational culture is unique. So I would start with that, right? I think that what defines culture, it's not only me thinking that, but it's people. People, they make culture. And you can have a great strategy, but there's a saying, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you can have a great strategy, but if the culture is not there to drive that strategy, it will fail. So I think it's very much important to highlight what the culture is so that also the individual that you're speaking to can associate with your culture. And then talk about some main social events that you're doing. That's also extremely important. So social events, professional events, they are forming the culture. How people are interacting with each other, that also comes down to key behaviors. Be able to provide just a couple, maybe 3 or 4 key behaviors that defines the culture of your organization. I would not go into, we are the largest company in the world. We have so many employees employed. We do revenue of this size. We have so many locations in so many countries, because if they did their homework well, they would already know, right? They have looked this up. So don't go into that. And it's also not unique how many locations that you have. I think it's also very much about alluding to recent innovations, right? They would like to see progress. There are many people that would like to work for a startup. There are many people who would like to work for scale-up, for well-established organizations, but it's very much about, okay, when I'm joining this organization, what kind of path is the organization on? And how can I contribute to that? How can I make an impact? So be prepared to make this very personal, to say, hey, if you are going to join us in this organization, being in this culture, your impact will be X, Y, Z. And I know that impact is a bit of a buzzword, so don't only say you can have an impact here, but provide tangible examples how that could look like. But also don't make it close, like this is what you can do, but ask a question also, to also pitch that and to have a conversation, not only sending information. How would you be able, how do you think that you will be able to make an impact on this organization based on what I just provided you with information-wise? So I think that that should be very clear about how the individual can contribute to the organization's success based on recent innovations, upcoming innovations, by describing the culture. I think that would be key.
Thanks. And that question of switching it around, how do you think you could, based on what you've seen and heard, how do you think you could make an impact here? Well, you don't need to sell it to them at all then, do you? Because they're then selling it to themselves. So it's a great question to be asking, to get somebody, again, reflecting on how they could make that impact and start to see themselves even working there. So I really like that way of doing it. That's great.
100%. Keeps it interactive as well. There's
Yeah.
nothing worse than somebody literally selling for 5 to 10 minutes straight and the candidate just switching off after a while because they just lost focus.
Totally agree.
Anything you would add, Marc Danielski?
Yeah, it's actually one of my favorite parts of the interview, to be honest, selling, well, obviously myself and Amoria Bond as a company, a potential future employer for the candidate. And I think something to be very, very mindful of is the fact that, well, obviously company culture is something that's very, very important for every company out there, but company culture as well as certain incentives, they're very individual, right? They're experienced in most cases, and sometimes a little bit harder to explain. And what one person likes doesn't necessarily mean that the other person likes as well. So something to be very mindful of is when selling is to not too much speak from one's own experience and put oneself's values as the value of the candidates as well, because that could, well, lead you down a path where you sell something that is absolutely not relevant for the candidate at all. So what I usually like to do is, well, the foundation of obviously every sell out there is ask questions and let the candidate literally dictate the own blueprint of what I'm going to sell back to them. And there is my favorite question in interviewing candidates to date is literally 2 words, and that is what else? So I ask the question, what is that you're looking for in a new employer, right? Let them start off, and I usually say stuff around a good culture and training and obviously development and growth, right? And then I'll follow up with the question, what else? Because it triggers the candidates to think, really think about what else are they looking for, right? What else is important for them? And that gives me a little bit of an indication on blueprint, what kind of unique selling points that we have to offer am I going to actually share with the candidate, and also provides me with a lot more insight if we can actually offer the candidate what they're looking for. Yeah, and I have this example on a regular basis. Some people are very money driven or financially driven, right? They don't care too much around us planting trees, for example, around the social footprint. They should, but not a lot of people do when they're financially motivated. On the other hand, you have a lot of people that could be great candidates that are not financially motivated, but they're motivated by what we do in terms of D&I or what we give back to society. And if I choose the wrong approach when selling a Amoria bond, it might actually put people off, whereas they could have been a great candidate for us and could have been a great company for them if I had chosen the right USPs. So my strategy when selling a Amoria bond or any company out there is always let the candidate actually dictate what they want to hear back from me, and then choose the right selling points to give that back to them and be as relevant as possible for them.
Thanks. Would many candidates describe themselves as being a passive job seeker, or I'm happy where I am, but I would move for a better opportunity, an improved opportunity? Would either of you adjust your approach to that, to an interview, in the knowledge that the person that you're speaking to is ultimately not necessarily active on the job market and is someone that might need a little bit more nurturing? So would you tailor your approach at all to that, or?
I always like this question, right? So fundamentally, I believe there is no such thing as a passive or an active candidate on an interview. And the reason why is that if they're not interested, with other words, they're not actively looking for a job, they're not having a conversation with you. So it's to learn why they're having this conversation with you. But everyone that you're interviewing is looking. Maybe they just don't know what exactly that they're looking for, but they're open for the conversation. Hence, they're looking for potentially something else now or towards the future. But there's no such thing in my mind as an active or passive job seeker during an interview.
No, I 100% agree with that. 100% agree with that. It does provide a nice insight, though. If somebody says, I'm not actively looking, right, and they have not realized it themselves, it provides us with a great opportunity to ask what they really like around their current employer, right?
Yeah.
And if we are able to match that, whereas somebody that is looking to leave the employer, that provides with a good opportunity to understand why, right? What is it that they're looking for that they're not getting right now? So there is a couple of extra questions to be asked depending on their answer, but I 100% agree with the statement that there are no passive or active candidates out there. If they're interviewing, they're interested.
End of.
Yeah.
Thank you. So our final question before we open it out to a Q&A, what would be some of your final tips around preparation?
Yeah, maybe I start with that one. Couple of very basic ones that I always go through when preparing for an interview myself. So obviously, well, the classic one, reading through the CV, understanding who that person is, what they've done in the past, making a couple of notes, right? A couple of questions that I already know I'm going to ask throughout the conversation. But I also like to go on LinkedIn, for example, to check if the information provided on the CV matches the information provided on the LinkedIn profile, or if there's some discrepancies that I can then ask some questions around. What I started doing a couple of months ago is actually sending candidates preparation emails as well. If they're excited to interview with me, right, and it's maybe a second or third interview, I will already send them some information around the structure of the interview, obviously the process, what is going to happen and what they can expect, but also maybe 1 or 2 questions that they can already think around ahead of the interview. That has multiple purposes. First of all, I get the information that I'm really looking for in the interview, but also it helps put the mind of the candidate a little bit at ease, because they already know what to expect. They're not going into the interview blank, because they know what questions will be coming, and they already might feel a little bit more confident because they did some preparation for the interview ahead of the chat itself. Yeah, I think those are a couple of the key preparation points that I do. Marc, you do anything else in addition to that?
No, I think it's pretty similar. We typically use the approach plan, interview, evaluate, group debrief, and then decide. And I think that the planning is very much about developing a success profile, which touches based on knowledge, experience, personal qualities, and behaviors. It's extremely important that you sit together with your interview panel. And then you can use as an exercise just to take a deck of cards. You can also do this virtually these days, and put the cards on the competencies that are most important, and use those competencies throughout the interview process. Interviews speak for itself. Evaluate is then what is extremely important is to consider the evidence and make individual ratings. And then finally, not finally, pre-final as a group, debrief on that and discuss as a team before deciding, making a final selection whom to hire. What's extremely important, like we're doing today, sharing knowledge and experiences, right? This is key, because you are not the only ones who are conducting the interview, right? So train your hiring community, not only your hiring managers, but everyone that is participating in the interview and selection process about interviewing techniques. This is also coming down to the first point made about mishires, that will highly reduce the number of mishires if everyone is trained utilizing the best interviewing techniques out there, and to continuously refresh that. So that will be my take on that. Next to what I like about what Marc said about providing you with information up front. So think about a kind of brochure that you provide to your candidates, which includes some information about the company, about the team, but also about how you do your interviews, so that they can prepare for that, so that it will not be a surprise to them.
The only thing to make sure is that they actually follow those steps then as well, and not, well, you could surprise them and see how they react in that situation as well, but usually it's better to follow the process lined out in the preparation email.
Agreed.
The group debrief, I just wanted to look at that quickly. Do you come to a group decision then, or do you then split out and make an individual decision and come back round?
Always. So it's important to make the decision as a group, because you have multiple people that look at the individual from multiple angles. So I think that typically, and there's research that can actually confirm this, that if you make those group decisions, the chances of hiring high performance and high potentials are increasing. It's not a guarantee, because if you don't provide that training to your hiring community, being part of that group, it will not work. But if individuals on the group will not agree to a mutual decision, my recommendation would always be to not hire the individual. Don't let the most senior individual making decisions.
Yeah, so I was going to come to that, the potential for the bandwagon effect. So do you navigate that then by saying, well, look, you need to stick to your decision here. Don't let anybody else sway your decision is your decision. Yeah. Don't let anybody else sway it.
Exactly, and that comes down to the whole preparation, right? Is that before you do your first interview, agree on this process. And if people don't agree, then that first needs to be sorted before starting the interview process. That's extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually have a question for you, Marc, as well, because I want to get your take on it. Because what we have done multiple times is, if multiple people interview a candidate, we assign somebody that is playing devil's advocate, right? That is going into the interview basically looking for reasons not to hire the candidate sometimes. Yeah, just to have a little bit of a voice of reason, somebody that is maybe not swayed by a great CV or anything. What will be your take on that? Do you think that it's goal-oriented, or is that something you will not do?
I personally have never done that. That does not mean that it can't be successful, but it comes down to the same, right? So if you still follow an interview process with a specific methodology, competency, behavioral-based interviewing, and the answers provided are as required or as wanted, an individual will not find any reasons not to hire the individual. You still have the same outcome. So I think in general, people should be always critical, very critical about the individual that they are willing to hire. So to me, it comes down to the same. But I would suggest for everyone to be critical about why you should hire the individual or why you should not hire the individual. But the outcome would be the same for me.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Conscious of the time, I could talk about this for a long time. It's a fascinating subject. However, I'd like to throw it out there to see if any of our community have any questions before we wrap up and ask Marc and Marc for their final thoughts. So do we have any questions for the panel? I'm just going to open it.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you hear me? Yes, I'm from Kavita from Hamburg, Germany. Cargill
Nice
company.
to meet you.
And the same here. I'm very grateful to you all that you have described or summarized the interview session. Good. My question is that how to bring the candidate at the end of the interview in the phase where no much expectation is related coming, from the external and internal party. Do you understand what my question is? Because we start with warm up, we start with setting up the stage, and in the middle of that we are on the high point where a lot of conversation is going on. At the end, how to close up this interview session, because this is the interview and the candidate is expecting something and you need time. Do you have some tips for me?
I'm sure we do. Thanks for your question. So how do we end the interview? Who wants to answer?
Shall I take this one, Marc?
Yes, of course, go for it.
Perfect, thank you. So don't wait until the end of the interview, right? At the start of the interview, already describe the interview process. And that does not have to be specific. So be ahead of that question and at the end of the conversation, to reiterate on that, right? So then be more specific about, hey, you can hear from working days, 2 working days, whatever is your problem. But I would say to repeat it at the end of the conversation, but to start with the conversation route, setting the right expectations towards the interview process as a whole. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I will also, it's a very good point, expectation management around feedback loops, because, well, candidates don't want to wait around for weeks and weeks to obviously hear back. And then very important to stick to those feedback loops as well, or keeping candidates informed on any potential delays. What I also like to iterate again at the end of an interview is if there are any open and unanswered questions, or if there are questions that weren't asked throughout the interview, but that come up on a later stage, to please follow up, to please reach out again, because, well, there is a potential lack of information there on the candidate side that we definitely want to cover in order to provide them with the best possible experience, but also to position ourselves in a best possible manner. So informing them to definitely ask questions, not feeling afraid to reach out again, I find very, very handy and very important as well.
Thank you so much. And I will take this time to say goodbye to you. I have to move on to the next meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
question.
Thanks for joining us.
I have a question, Andy.
You did, David. I was absolutely about to read it out, but since you started talking, go for it. The floor is yours.
First things first, Marc, pleased to see you, as both Marcs, but Mr. Stuut particularly.
Likewise.
There's a few aspects to this question. So the first one is when to feed back. Do you ever feed back in the interview itself? So when you get to an end of an interview, if it's apparent to you that somebody's either a fit, that's notwithstanding colleague feedback, or if it's clear to you that that person's an absolute non-fit, are you transparent in the interview around feedback, or do you wait afterwards? What would you suggest?
So I can maybe start us off there. It depends a little bit on the situation. If I absolutely know that somebody is a non-fit throughout the interview, I will at a certain point cut it off and explain my reasoning why. And the reason behind this is, well, time is very precious, right, for the candidate and for us. And if we already know that they're not reaching an agreement, then it's just fair towards the candidate to express that, so they have time to obviously move on and find a different opportunity. That's my take on it. At the end of an interview, I usually don't like to feedback right away, because if I got to this point in time, there is certain doubt in my mind if the candidate is a fit or not a fit. Sometimes I immediately know, which is when I'm going to go over to planning in the next step right away. If I'm unsure, I will give back candidate the benefit of doubt and will mention to them that I will need to deliberate with either my colleagues or go through my notes again or gather my thoughts in order to reach to a decision, because what I don't want them to feel is like making a snapshot decision in a moment that might not reflect the outcome of the interview.
Yeah, I agree to that. My additional take on that would be, I would be very much interested to learn why the individual is asking the question. So why do you want to know? Maybe there are certain reasons why this individual needs that information at that moment in time, but in general, I always provide feedback if the individual will be rejected or will be passing on to the next interview stage. I will always provide detailed information about the reasons why I came to my decision. But I typically do not, well, I never do actually do this in the interview. But I would be interested to learn why they're asking the question, because that also tells me something about the individual.
Yeah. Okay. Just as an aside, I'm an old interviewer, so I'm going to share some or impart some of my own experience there. It's rarely used as a technique for the interviewer to share back information with the interviewee. And actually, you can get the feedback from an interviewee that that's the case, because a lot of the time post-interview, many organizations and many line managers who've interviewed an interviewee haven't fed back at all. So it's a little bit like taking an exam where you got some of your questions wrong, but you don't know what you got wrong. And as a consequence, I find when there's an opportunity where it's very clear to me that something either isn't right or is right, I like to pick up on that and share that with the individual. And I use that as a candidate experience moment, because if I know that person's leaving the interview and he's unlikely to progress, I at least want them to walk away with that sense of the organization's, been caring enough and transparent enough to share a view. So that's my first view. And I've found that actually over the years, I've had a lot of feedback from people to say, actually, that doesn't ever happen. We never get that feedback. It's really helpful, and thanks for the coaching. The second question I've got, if you don't mind me hogging the airwaves, is time. How important do you think is building time into the interview process? And what I mean by this, when you've got multiple stages, I know that the rush nowadays is to try and complete those stages as quickly as possible and involve stakeholders each stage as quickly as possible, so that in the fight for talent that there's no lag in terms of performance, in terms of conversion of that interview to a potential hire. But do you conversely think it's important to build time in and create, if you like, desire from the candidate side, Marc? Marc Stuut, this is, I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think that time is everyone's most valuable asset, right? So we need to manage that and set the right expectations once again to what they can expect. That does not only count for candidates, but also counts for the hiring manager. They're very much situational, right? So it depends on the situation, depends on the individual, on the candidate as well. Because if we reflect on passive, active candidates, some candidates might not be willing to make a fast decision. So you can rush that through with the chance of losing the individual throughout the process. So you need to also be mindful of that, right? I think in general, what you see with hiring managers and working with recruiters is they put a lot of pressure on time, right? Because typically, if it's related to opportunities to grow teams or to have replacement for individuals leaving their team soon, they would like to still make their targets, to still be successful, pretty much dependent on resources headcount. But I would not be forced to make too fast decisions. But once again, coming down to what you said at the start of the interview process, even before that, is to determine what is the component time here. How important is time throughout the interview process? So I think it's very situational. So it depends on the position that you're recruiting for, and it also depends on the individual that you're interviewing.
Okay, great. It's really interesting to hear. I've got one final one, really, which is less of a formal technical question. It's more for humour, and I'm sorry if I put you on the spot, but what from your recollections, you've all interviewed a lot of people over your time in your professional careers. What's the one that stands out as the most unusual?
There've been a lot. I can kick us off maybe on that one. It's actually, well, for comedy sakes, there's two coming to mind. I interviewed a candidate about a year ago, I would imagine, and we had an interview which was rather short because it was very clear from the start that there wasn't a fit for both sides. He actually smoked 3 cigarettes in the 15 minutes that we had the interview together, and he literally told me to hold on. Then he put the phone down on me and called me back because he had to light another cigarette throughout the interview, which was quite an unusual experience for me. The second one was recent. It was a lady that was house sitting for 2 cats, and it now and then happens that cats obviously run over the keyboard or that they're doing stuff. But well, those 2 cats that were, let's say, on the couch in the background enjoying a good time together. And the lady was literally stone-faced. She must have seen it because she was looking in the camera, but she remained completely unfazed and continued the interview as if nothing was happening, while I completely lost my focus and composure and completely lost structure throughout the process as well. I didn't know where to go from that point onwards because I was so distracted.
Yeah, from my personal experience, we all been through that, doing those virtual interviews, right? Or hearing a toilet flushing, thinking that they're on mute, which they're not. So, and then they're saying things that they don't want you to hear. We all been through that, I guess. But I will not mention the country, but I've been in an interview where a candidate showed up, but it turned out not to be the individual that was on the CV, nor was on LinkedIn. So I was looking at the individual, and I was actually asked a question like, you look a little bit different than when I was looking up your LinkedIn profile, where the individual responded to that, yeah, I look different, I exercise a little bit more. And I was like, yeah, it could be plausible, but that definitely was not the case. So I was actually finding out that this was a totally different person selling the other one.
Oh, goodness.
I've got loads, but I'm going to share 2 really quickly. The first one was a long time ago now. We got a phone call saying the candidate was late. He said, I'm late, my train's late. And then he walked in holding a steaming hot cup of Starbucks, which is next door to the office. The train station is not next door to the office. So as he strolled in holding this very full steaming hot cup of coffee, he took one look at us and realised the mistake he'd made, turned around to walk back out again, and that was the end of the interview. And then the other one was a recent one. And I try not to do these at home. For this reason, it's a busy house, as you know. I was doing an interview a couple of weeks ago, and I was sat in the study, and the door opened. It was one of my kids, and I'd expressly asked them not to come in, but of course they chose to ignore that. And it was my youngest, my 5-year-old, and he walked up to me. I'm thinking this could be anything now. I could be in trouble for not doing this, that, and the other. But he walked up and just said to me, "I just came in to give you a big hug." So, and this is being recorded. So there's a recorded interview where my 5-year-old comes in and gives me a big hug and then just walks back out again. And that was it. So those are the 2 that I would share.
Fantastic.
I've seen that one. Very wholesome.
Thanks for addressing those questions, particularly being brave enough to do the last one. And good to see you, Marc.
Likewise.
Thanks, David. If there's any more questions while we're summing up, we'd welcome them. If not, just to say thank you very much to Marc and Marc. Any final thoughts from you, and then we'll wrap up.
I just have a couple of words. It has to do with state of mindset. You need to be in the right mindset to be able to have a good interview, right? You need to be positive. You need to be able to provide that sentiment to your candidates. be structured, and always provide the best possible experience that you can provide for the candidate.
100% agree with that one. We all have bad days, right? We all have situations where we're not feeling up to it, but it is so important to provide everyone with the same chance and the courtesy of being on top of our game and really giving our best when we're interviewing candidates, because it's not an easy experience for most of people as well, right? A lot of people have done multiple interviews in their lifetime, but I've also interviewed people that are literally conducting their first interview ever in their career. And therefore, it's very important to provide them with the best possible experience, not to make them scared about their next interview if they ever have one. So if we hire them, we hope to stay with us. But we need to be there for them to obviously provide them with future help, insight, feedback, and learning moments as well in that interview. So I definitely agree.
Thanks. I actually find, to sum up on that, I think interviews are a great antidote to a bad day, because I love nothing more than meeting new people in these environments, seeing people with great potential and great commitment. So if you are having the bad day and you walk into that room and you can see immediately the enthusiasm and the potential on the other side of the table, so I think it's a great antidote to a bad day doing an interview. Thank you very much, everybody. Are there any final questions? I don't think there are, but again, thanks for your input, your expertise. That was Let's Talk About Conducting Excellent Job Interviews. Please, and thank you very much to everyone who's joined us today. Please keep your eye out on our LinkedIn page. There will be more Let's Talk Abouts. We will also be reaching out to you for your feedback on what you found most useful about the session. To Marc and the team involved in setting everything up. Thank you very much indeed, and we wish everyone a great rest of your day and a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Marc.